Previously, in Chapter 1 of Uncommon, Book 1 in the Chronicles of the Common series, Eva and LUHCEAN found themselves transported to a mysterious empty white room, separated by a wall of glass and imprisoned. And now, Chapter 2, LUHCEAN. The heated look in the beautiful brunette's eyes was far from that of a dead woman. She rolled her eyes and shook her head and then continued her inspection of the cell. I was impressed by her attempt to inspect the light. Then again, she was a figment of my dreams. Of course I would construct an impressive woman. And she truly was impressive. Her dark brown hair and mesmerizing brown eyes were a stark contrast to her pale skin that nearly glowed beneath the bright lights of our cells. She was long and lean, but curved and strong. She was an enigma. Her form didn't possess any of the stereotypical species traits in the common. She was the ideal blend of the best qualities from each of the species. And if I didn't stop staring at her, my flight suit would soon become unbearably constricted. It felt odd to wear a flight suit again. It felt odd to actually feel the flight suit. In my long centuries, I had never experienced a dream this realistic. I looked down at my chest, noting the absence of my beard, and ran a hand over my jaw, feeling the short hairs prickle against my palm. My hair, too, was shorter than reality. But that wasn't uncommon. Throughout the years, I've had enough dreams in different forms to come to expect it. However, my dreams usually were of shifting into animals beyond my capabilities, not a haircut and a shave for the sake of presentability. This was the most bizarre experience I'd had in years. Why I would create a dream woman who believed herself dead was intriguing. More curious was the fact that I placed her just out of reach. Did I truly believe that even in my dreams I couldn't possess a woman alive or dead? That I was lucid enough to analyze the dream was also confounding. I sat against the wall at the back of my half of our cell and watched the woman pace. She didn't appear to be injured. Her stride was strong and confident. Her clothing was odd, not the type of attire I would have mentally conjured for her. But they were definitely intact and lacking the telltale signs of injury. She worried a lip between her teeth and scrunched her nose in frustration. I was torn between feeling sympathy for the woman and amusement at her determination. She's not real, I reminded myself. I wondered what her name would be, if she were real. I imagined it would be something elegant, something simple and straightforward. What would she smell like? Would she be sweet or woodsy? Without a doubt, her emotions would scent strongly. She would be a constant feast of changing aromas. I shook my head. I was putting far too much thought into an imagined woman. She sauntered back to the glass wall and stared at me with her hands on her rounded hips. My lips twitched at a smile, but I suspected a full grin would only inflame her frustration. My dream woman was inquisitive, and most definitely impatient. She wanted answers, now. Unfortunately, I had none to give her. This dream was just as much a mystery to me as it was to my imagined companion. The woman pointed at me, then pretended to pound on the glass. Break it? I asked. It wasn't a bad idea. I doubted I could break down the wall, but if I could manage to put even a small hole in the glass, we might be able to speak to each other. I pushed against the floor to rise when suddenly the woman's mouth opened on a scream. Her back bowed and her fingers clawed at the glass wall. I froze in horror. Her beautiful face twisted and her body contorted in pain. Her feet were firmly planted, but they slipped on the slick floor as a mysterious force began to pull her away from the glass. Her fingers groped the air for purchase, her eyes rounded wide with fear. I shot to my feet and leaped for the glass. Pounding against the wall, I watched as her body was dragged to the middle of the room, then suspended in midair. She was quickly flipped to float on her stomach, her limbs flailing wildly. As her mouth opened on another silent scream, her hair flew into her face, clinging to her cheeks wet with tears. The woman lifted her head and reached out to me. Fisting my hands, I renewed my attack on the glass without producing so much as a crack. The woman's eyes fluttered and then her body went limp. The white light above her flared blindingly, forcing me to cover my sensitive eyes. For long minutes, the brightly pulsing light consumed her side of the cell. I squinted through my fingers to briefly see her body gone, now entirely engulfed by the light. Why would I do this? Why would I cause my imagined woman pain? I paced the length of the glass, frustrated with myself for the nightmare this dream had become, and carefully watched the light from the corner of my eye. Gods, it felt like I paced forever, but the light remained. Eventually, I returned to my seat at the back of the room and waited. For hours, I willed myself to wake up. I couldn't sit in this tiny room and watch her being consumed any longer. I tried to escape into a shift, but my beast was suspiciously absent. He hadn't stirred once during this entire experience, which was one of the most disturbing oddities of the dream. My beast was always on the edge and ready to surface. He usually relished playing in dreams. I was desperate to give over to his madness, but again he failed me. Time was elusive. I counted my breaths until it felt like days had passed. I closed my eyes, searching for non-existent sleep inside the dream. Centuries passed from one heartbeat to the next. I thought myself on the verge of insanity, and the light abruptly disappeared. I crawled to the glass on stiff legs. Thankfully, the woman was still there. She hung in the middle of the room, arms and head dangling beneath her as if hanging off an invisible table. I pounded against the glass, hoping to wake her. For some reason, I needed to know she was unharmed. Her fingers twitched, and I pounded harder. "That's it, Ashna. Wake up," I shouted. Her head lifted. Beautiful brown eyes met my own. They were dazed and foggy. Then she realized she was still suspended mid-air, and her eyes turned wild, searching for a way down from her position. Her arms spun and her legs kicked, but her efforts did little good. I beat against the glass again, trying once more to reach her. Nothing either of us tried appeared to work. She lifted an arm and stretched, reaching for me, the tips of her fingers a mere breath from the glass. Her eyes pleaded with me, begging for help. Heart heavy with defeat, I rested my forehead on the glass and placed my palm near her reaching fingers. She kicked and stretched, her arm impossibly farther. The tip of her middle finger brushed the glass over my palm. The glass beneath my hand quivered, and my fingers slipped beneath the cool surface. Shock momentarily stilled my fist, then I pushed through the malleable substance. My hand burst through the other side, and my fingers clenched around the woman's outstretched hand. Her mouth dropped open in surprise. Without pause, she flung her other hand forward and gripped my wrist. "Pull!" she yelled, her shout muffled through the small, viscous hole, but perfectly understandable. I groaned and nearly went hard at the mere sound of the woman's voice. I nodded, not entirely confident this was a good idea. I pulled. Whatever was holding her in place wasn't giving her up without a fight. She winced at the strain on her limbs, but squeezed my hand tighter. I tugged harder. Slowly and steadily, she began to creep forward. Our fingers slipped, and I quickly pushed my other hand through the hole, adding a firmer grip to her fingers. I continued to pull and tug her to the glass, my muscles quaking with the effort. Passing the point of no return, our joined hands finally cleared the pliable hole. I paused, and the woman looked at me with incredulity filling her eyes, her feet kicking the air in frustration. "This is taking too long," I shouted. "Seriously?" she yelled back. I quickly surveyed the glass and formed a new strategy. "Trust me," I called out to her. "Like I have a choice?" she snarled. I flashed her a quick smile, bravery and a snarky attitude. She was most definitely my dream woman. I gripped her wrists, leaned back and braced my feet against the glass and tugged with all of my weight. Soon her head passed through the glass, and then her shoulders. Whatever was holding on to her in the other half of our cell abruptly let go. She swiftly passed through the wall, and the two of us tumbled to the ground. She landed on my chest, her nose nearly brushing my own. We paused, breathing heavily and staring into each other's eyes. "Thanks," she whispered. "You're—" My words stuck in my throat as her scent finally hit me. She was unlike anything I had ever encountered in my life. Her unique blend of innocence and temptation nearly knocked me out. My mouth watered, my eyes rolled in my head, my fangs itched to grow. Before I knew what I was doing, I pulled her head to the side and opened my mouth to bite. My eyes flew open and I bolted upright in bed. Vrack! I was clearly wide awake, back in my cabin on the Pollux, but the dream woman's scent still filled my nose and clung to my skin. I knew in my bones that scent would haunt me for the rest of my long, miserable life. I dropped to my knees, settling between the blonde's thighs. She wrapped her lean legs around my waist, locking her ankles at the small of my back, urging me closer. Curling an arm around my neck, she pulled me in, forcing me to drop my weight onto her. She slipped an arm over my shoulder and down my back, gripping the bottom of my shirt and sliding it up to my neck. The wily blonde unlocked her ankles and caressed one knee against my side, propping her foot on my thigh. Releasing her hold around my neck, she braced her foot against my leg and pushed distance between our chests. My mind drifted back to the dream, and my eyes closed, remembering the feel, the sound, the scent of that woman. Suddenly the blonde gripped my bunched shirt at my nape and crossed her arms in front of my neck, locking her ankles around my waist. Once again she caged me close. That's what I get for being distracted. I attempted to push an arm between our bodies and force her to release, but she clung tight to my now bucking form. Her grip on the shirt tightened, and she squeezed her crossed arms deep into my throat. I twisted and pushed against her constricting limbs, unable to reverse our positions without seriously harming her. Her arms pressed deeper against my collapsing windpipe. Gasping for breath, I finally relented and tapped her shoulder. Immediately she released her grip and pulled back, grinning. I did it. I had you, didn't I? Ileana beamed with pride. I coughed and sat back on my knees, taking a moment to relish the fresh air. You did. I only have one correction. While wrapping your arm around the neck, force the attacker's head to the side and away from you. I could have taken out your throat before you completed the choke, I instructed. Ileana's expression of joy died. Vrack. I couldn't stop my responding grin. The curse falling from her pouting lips was as out of place as winter on Heliash Prime. Ileana's large green eyes, full mouth, and long blonde hair were tamed by a button nose dusted with freckles. Behind the beguiling mask of innocence, the sweet blonde Matri possessed the determination of a warrior. Lee, you've made great strides in physical combat and defense. But weapons are my greatest asset. I know, she interrupted. Matri don't have the strength and speed to compete with the other species. That doesn't mean I have to like it. Good. Push your boundaries. Few species would have expected that chokehold from a witch. Keep your opponent off guard. I pushed off the ground and retrieved 2 bottles of water from the bench and tossed one to Ileana. Did you get past my shields? No, she replied with a careless shrug. I was moderately relieved considering my dream distraction. Every Matri had one gift, and at least one primary magic. Ileana's gift was telepathy. I had hoped training her to read and identify an opponent's next move would improve her odds in physical combat. Unfortunately, after years of sparring, she was still unable to penetrate my naturally strong mental shields, although I suspected she wasn't extending the same effort in her mental attacks as she did in her physical training. Did you even try to get past my shields? I asked. I did, she said, clearly affronted by the accusation. Your shields are as impenetrable as ever, one of the many reasons why I love you dearly. Matri telepaths and empaths were burdened with the constant effort of shielding their own minds to protect from the bombardment of ambient thoughts and emotions. Long spans immersed in crowds and large populations would eventually cripple the witch. Many were forced into seclusion and often took their own lives as a final bid for release from the continuous mental strain. Ileana was no different. 1 week out of every 8 she would leave her home among the overcrowded Matri refugee camps and seek solitude. Much to my dismay, her refuge had become my secluded bunker in the middle of the unnaturally large Quilera asteroid belt. In the beginning, I had been desperate for her presence. Ileana's primary magic was healing. After the massacre of Vihara, it had been Ileana who had brought me back from the brink of death, nearly exhausting her own magic in the process. Against the orders of her own people, she maintained contact and continued to check in regularly. Ileana had forced her way into my isolated bunker under the pretense of healing and slowly became a constant fixture in my life. If it weren't for her friendship, I'd have gone mad years ago. And it is because I love you dearly as a friend that I feel it's my duty to inform you. It's time we cut your hair. Just because you live like a hermit doesn't mean you have to look like one, Ileana said, curling her lip at my braided mane. I wash regularly and braid it up. Why do I need to cut my hair? If you want to look like a fae, then keep the hair, although I'm not sure all of that, she gestured to my large keddy frame, could ever be mistaken for fae. But the beard has to go. What's wrong with my beard? I dropped my chin to examine the dozens of long brown plates. I had to admit the pull on my chin as they had become trapped between our grappling bodies had been a distraction. In an actual battle, they would have been a fatal detriment. But it had been 30 years since I'd fought another person in earnest, and I didn't see any chance of it in the near future. At this rate, I doubted I ever would again. In truth, I was perfectly fine with that. I've had enough battles to last 1,000 lifetimes, and I had no desire to add to the count. I suddenly realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd taken a knife to either head or beard. Both masses of hair had grown to waist length, becoming more unruly than I liked. I simply hadn't felt the need to bother maintaining social standards. Why waste the time? I had recognized several small unconscious rebellions weeks ago. I had stopped bathing regularly. I wasn't making plans for the future. I had even delayed planting new crops until supplies had been dangerously low. The seemingly neglectful acts had been the first spark of concern for my sanity. Despite the awareness, I still had done nothing meaningful to rectify the rebellious behavior. What isn't wrong with it? I can't imagine how long it must take to braid all of that without magic. Can you even find your face through the unbraided mess? Ileana asked. I raised a brow in a mock glare. I don't want to show up for a visit only to find you tangled in a machine with your face chewed off, she said. I rolled my eyes at her dramatics and returned to the floor to stretch. After years of friendship, I could tell Ileana was working her way around to a subject she was reluctant to approach directly. I continued to stretch and waited her out. You're always reminding me to be prepared. What if pirates stormed the bunker and the shadow of your unnaturally long braids gives away your position, she teased. I grunted in amusement. It had been over a decade since a ship had wandered even remotely close to my asteroid. What if a sexy pirate girl fleeing a crew of evil skin traders landed in the bunker seeking aid? She stole from our latest exchange of romance novels. That's fiction, Lee, I said. Things like that don't happen in real life, and why are you obsessed with pirates? You never know, and they're always swarthy in the books. I have yet to meet a swarthy pirate in real life, she said with a pout. Ileana extended her arms in front of her, stretching to touch her toes, and dropped her head to her thighs. What if I brought a pretty friend to come visit? She asked, voice muffled against her legs. I gripped her ankle and tugged with more force than necessary, sliding her across the floor and practically into my lap. She gave a squeak of alarm and leaned back in an effort to gain distance. No visitors. You are my closest friend, but if I suspect you're planning to bring a stranger to this bunker, I will block your access to the portal. Do you understand me? I was on the verge of exploding. The first rule we had established was absolutely no visitors were permitted in my asteroid. Ileana could come and go as she liked, but no one else. No one could know of the portal to my bunker, and no one could travel the portal. No one but her. Understood. No visitors, and I'm sorry to inform you that I am your only friend. Ileana raised her brow in challenge. Then you'll just have to come to Atlanta to meet her. And there it was. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and sighed in frustration. She had finally come to the subject she'd been reluctant to approach. Ileana was playing matchmaker. "I am not leaving the bunker," I said. "She's Hada, a Matri and Ketty hybrid. She's a few inches taller than I am, a lovely blonde with long curls. She has a great figure and witty personality. She's 64 years old." "No, Ileana," I scolded. "I'm not leaving the bunker. And 60? That's far too young to even consider." "You'd consider someone older?" Her voice rose at the prospect of my capitulation. "No," I firmly said. I released her ankle and stood to walk away, ending the conversation. "Let's practice your throwing." Her soft exhalation was followed by the gentle whir of a blade slicing through the still air. I quickly took a step to the left. The knife soared past and struck the wall with a thud, vibrating with the impact. She released another, and I ducked as the blade passed overhead to land in the wall near its mate. She released yet another blade, and I spun in the crouch to pluck the knife from the air. Ileana ground her jaw and flashed her eyes with fury. The squalid scent of frustration infused the room. "Why are you mad at me?" I asked in confusion. "Why are you giving up?" she countered. "I'm not giving up." "You are. You already have. I don't need to read your mind to know. I can see it written all over you," she shouted. "Because I haven't cut my hair?" "You haven't cut your hair. You're almost done with the latest upgrades to the ship, and you still don't have plans for more. You haven't even asked me for a report on the camps. I've been here for 2 days, and the only thing you've asked is if I brought more books. Books without sex." I dropped to sit on the training room floor, numb and unable to even muster a half-hearted denial. I focused on the knife playing through my fingers, refusing to see the disappointment in her eyes. I knew she was right. I'd been sliding in and out of depression for years. Isolation had been slowly eating away my resolve. My one saving grace had been hope. "He's not alive, but he's not dead either." Ileana's confused voice had been the one to pull me from the abyss, gifting me the slim lifeline of hope. I desperately clung to that lifeline, even after we had exhausted all possible means to bring my brother back. Through all of the years and faced with failure after failure, I had managed to still hold on to that meager tether of hope. Over the last 5 years, that tether had withered to a fraying thread, until I couldn't tell if it even existed. I breathed by habit and woke by routine. My days had become mechanical. I had well and truly lost my grip. Ileana knelt before me and pulled the knife from my fingers. She gathered my hands and gave them a slight shake. "There is not a soul in the common who could have survived what you have. You need to remember that you did survive. I know you wish you hadn't. There have been times when you looked at me with such hate and regret in your eyes." I opened my mouth to protest, concerned by the stale scent of her sorrow, but she shook her head to silence me. "I don't blame you, and I know you don't blame me. Not really, but—" She hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "Kai wouldn't want this for you, this life. He would be horrified to know this is how you've been living. Because you're not living, Luke. You're not. Please, we can't lose you too." I pulled her into a tight hug, deeply touched by her brave honesty and tender concern. "I know, I know," she responded. "I love you, Lee." "I love you too, you big hairy Ketty," Ileana said, rubbing her sniffling nose across my shoulder. "Did you wipe your nose on my sleeve?" I tried not to laugh. "Rack woman, why are you still unmated?" "I have this terrible habit of turning all of the men with impenetrable shields into best friends." I gave her one last squeeze, then let her go. She pulled back and wiped the tears from her eyes. "This is why you suggested visiting more often," I stated. I had known she had been troubled and felt a touch of shame for not being the one brave enough to approach her. "Yes, and no." Ileana took a deep breath and met my eyes. "I can't take it anymore. The camps are beyond capacity. They need every healer they can get, but I just can't. Most of the boys are so young they have no shields to speak of. The horrors they have suffered come pouring through even when the camp is quiet with sleep. I want to help. I need to help. But I can't. The witch refugee camps were far different from the Hada camps. The hybrid camps were diverse communities spanning the entire sector, accepting all well-meaning hybrids and species shunned by their homeworlds. The witches' camps were exclusive to Matri heritage and well hidden in the Matriku territory. Females typically possessed stronger magic and thus formed a matriarchal society. Males were subjugated and often treated as disposable commodities from birth. Young boys were regularly abused and sold into military service or slavery. The Matri camps were filled with damaged young males who required extensive physical and emotional healing. Ileana had been fighting for them her entire life, and her kind heart was paying a steep price. It was my turn to squeeze her hands in support. You can't go back to the camps, Lee, but you can't stay here either. I know, and neither can you, she said. I have a proposal for you. I pulled back in dawning understanding. Don't get that look with me. I'm a healer by nature, and we both need some intense healing. I hoped she wasn't implying what that comment suggested. I loved the woman, like a sister, only ever as a sister. My aversion must have been clear on my face because she dropped her jaw and made a sound of disgust in her throat. Ugh, not that, you idiot! She smacked me on the shoulder. I'm proposing we get this big hunk of a cargo ship off this rock and do something. We could run search and rescue for the refugees, or negotiate an alliance between our people again. Let's haul cargo for the camps. Anything. Let's just fly. Ileana's desperation poured out of her. Her large eyes sparkled with hope, and her heart raced with the passion of her words. She didn't just want me to leave the security of this bunker and join the common again. She wanted me to join the fight again. But the idea of facing another Vahara was unbearable. What if I can't anymore? I whispered. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, then she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin in defiance. Then we will find something you do want to fight for. I did not save your big hairy ass just to have you slowly lose your mind and die. She stood to loom over me in adorable bravado. I'm going to feed Didi, and you're going to think about my proposal. Before I leave, remember that if you reject my proposal, I have an adorable little familiar who has a penchant for stealing shiny tools from your workshop. Ileana gave a wicked grin and strutted out of the training room. Witch. Ileana had waited a handful of hours for me to ponder her proposal. Then the harassment began. Her first attack had been a slow build of questions. Which quadrant would I prefer to travel? Had I ever traveled through the underworld? What type of cargo could the Pollux hold? Questions had been never-ending. Aside from her visits, I've spent nearly all of the last 30 years not uttering a single word to another soul. This new attack of conversation was quickly escalating to torturous levels. I eventually resorted to hiding away in the starboard drive, completing the wiring of the third set of NOS guns, a task I had planned to hold until Ileana departed. Her second round of attacks came in the form of her accomplice, Didi. Neshi were rarely found as familiars. Excitable and mischievous, the little creatures grew to a size no larger than my palm, with a long tail of double the length. They lived among the forests and parks in the Matriku system, leaping from the branches and extending the loose skin between their 4 limbs to glide to the next tree. Each limb ended in a palm with 5 long digits able to grip and climb almost any surface. Their reputation as a nuisance was well earned for their habit to liberate park visitors of food or shiny objects from pockets, bags, and even directly from your hand. Large ears topped a triangular head with narrow-set black eyes and a whiskered little black nose. Most Neshi were brown or striped with black. Didi was pure white. Didi had found me wiring the guns and quickly climbed on my back to rest on my shoulder with her head nestled into my neck. Soon she had begun to snore. Loudly. At first I found the sound amusing and I smiled at her affection. After 3 hours of the noise vibrating through my sensitive Kedi ears, it began to grate on my nerves. After prying the little bundle off my shoulder, I set her inside the tool bag. Mistake. Reaching for the driver to close the control panel, I found the bag empty, except for Dee. "Dee, where are my tools?" I barked at the lounging Nessie. "Lise said Uncle Luke need help. Dee helping. What tool you want?" The Nessie familiar spoke into my mind. Familiars often functioned as an assistant for the matri to which they were bound. Thus, they were nearly always gifted with the ability to mentally speak to other species. I gritted my teeth and prayed for patience. "The driver, please." The white little ball of fur hustled down the crawlway and disappeared behind a conduit. A few moments later, she returned. "This?" She held up the tool. "No, that's a scanner. I want a driver." She dashed along the crawlway and behind a support beam, taking the scanner with her. Dee soon came running back with a new tool in hand, the scanner once again hidden. "This?" She pushed the tool in my direction. Closing my eyes in frustration, I took a deep breath. "No, that's a welding pin. It has a red handle with a button on top and a small head shaped like a star. The driver, please." She paused and looked thoughtful. Take longer. Wait here." Then she turned to leave. "Wait, leave the pen with me," I demanded. "No," she stated. Before I could reach the monster, she snuck behind me to run in the opposite direction. After leaping to a pipe and climbing to the narrow gap in the hull, she disappeared into the crevice leading to the deck above. She hid the blasted tools all over this ship, I realized. I pulled a knife from my leg sheath and wedged the tip into the fastener, twisting the blade to secure the panel firmly in place. I could fix the damaged blade later. Task completed, I stood to exit the access tunnel and left the empty bag in place. The creature could pack it up herself. Ileana and I needed to have a conversation about loose tools hidden within the drive, which was supposed to be one of the few areas of the ship that was strictly off-limits to the little white menace. After exiting the access hatch on Deck 1, I reached the central intersection and turned into the primary hub. An unfamiliar alarm screamed through the ship. It took me a moment to recognize the alert. 2 short beeps followed by one long tone. Medbay. Impossible. I sprinted to the stairs curving around the central aquaponics tank and vaulted over the railing to land in the middle of the staircase, then bolted to Deck 2. I spun around the corner and through the hatch to Medbay just as Ileana burst through the opposite hatch from the outside hub. We paused to stare at each other in shock. In unison, we swiveled our heads in the direction of the surgery. Through the glass, a red light flashed. Sitting in the middle of the room, the med pod glowed white and silver from the activated regeneration nanos. Neither Ileana nor I dared to move. We didn't dare breathe. Fear of shattering this reality froze us in place. "Do you think?" Ileana whispered. "I hope," I cautiously replied. We slowly approached the surgery and paused. I pushed open the hatch, leading the way into the surgery, then we took up positions on opposite sides of the pod, waiting for the nanofluid to drain into the tank beneath. The glimmering liquid began to swirl with clouds of red. Clenching and unclenching my fists, I waited the agonizing minutes for the fluid to drain. Slowly, the solution revealed the form of my brother. Kai was healed and whole. Ileana entered the code to open the pod, and I lifted the hatch, pushing up the dome to lock into the ceiling above. I pressed numb fingers to Kai's neck and held my breath. Nothing. Nothing. A beat. That was a beat. Then another. Ileana extended her hands over Kai's head and chest, then closed her eyes. Bright green tendrils of magical mist drifted from her hands and sank into Kai's skin. The soft scent of teru flowers filled the room. Afraid to move and distract her, I flinched against the nervous energy begging to be released. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the simplicity of breathing. "He's alive," she finally whispered. Subscribe to continue listening and discover if Kai finally wakes from his mysterious 30-year sleep. If you liked what you heard, the Uncommon ebook can be purchased at all major retailers for only 99 cents. Thank you for listening.